Good morning. My name is Carrie Ann Kohler-Monroe, and I'm an environmental program specialist with Agriculture, Forestry, Rural Economic Development Department. Thanks for attending this morning's Sustainability Series webinar presentation. This series is focusing on agriculture's industry's approach and initiatives on sustainability. It was started really to increase department and stakeholders' awareness about these sustainability initiatives and to improve cooperation and collaboration amongst ourselves. Our presenter for the 2001 Environmentally Sustainable Agriculture Tracking Survey results is Sven Anders. Sven Anders is a professor with the Faculty of Agriculture, Life and Environmental Science, Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at the University of Alberta. Sven focuses on agriculture economics with research and teaching interests in the economics of food systems, supply chains, and agri-food trade. His research has studied consumer preferences and behavior in the context of food quality and safety, product differentiation, and competition in grocery retailing, and the impacts of food standards in international agri-food marketing and trade. In working with Sven and his team on this project, it was apparent that he has a passion for the agri-food industry, and we are fortunate to have that passion focused on the environmentally sustainable agriculture tracking survey. I'll now hand it over to Sven to share the results and of course, all the hard work that's been done.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this webinar. Thanks for attending, and I hope it's going to be interesting. I have prepared a lot of information because these surveys and the last survey is rich in information, and my objective here is to give everybody a taste of how valuable this resource actually is for policy, but I think also for industry-related questions. And so there is a student, Sarah van Weingarten, who has helped me with the research on the 2021 version of this ESA survey. And thanks to Laura and Carrie Ann for supporting our work here. Before we get into great details, I want to mention that AFRED, or AAF as it was formerly known, has been following producers in sustainability and agri-environmental related awareness and adoption patterns for over 30 years. And we're chatting casually about the fact that Laura uncovered a first survey of this kind from 1988. So there's a rich history. The first official survey was fielded in 1991, and since then there have been 10 biannual sort of iterations, and the last one we did collaboratively in 2021. And if you have any specific questions related to these ESAT surveys and how they are used, then I would refer you to Laura Ang, who's leading this effort in the Natural Resources Management branch for over 12 years now. In 2021, this was a collaborative effort, so a little bit of research and a little bit of a continuation of the regular policy work by AFRED. And the focus here was measuring the uptake, but also the perceptions producers across Alberta have when it comes to these agri-environmental best management practices. And it is valuable in and of itself because it's one of the few very representative surveys of Alberta farmers and ranchers that also has a very good regional coverage. And so we have the ability to not only observe the manager, so the person responding to the survey, but also understand production system factors, how land is managed, how ownership is split up, and various other factors that help us to get this rich insight in how producers behaving in this space, how they're adopting these agri-environmental best management practices. So here are sort of the questions that I would want to answer and the insights I want to provide as an overview. So I'm going to show adoption patterns or perceptions of these agri-environmental BMPs to help us better understand how farmers make adoption decisions. And I think this is very important for improving policy in this area, and also industry and governmental program support in helping more sustainable agricultural practices in the province. I'm not just focusing on these BMPs, I also want to provide an overview of the decision support tools that farmers are using in the respective context. Shed a little bit of light on what farmers in Alberta think about sustainable sourcing and the effects that this may have on their operations. Also look into the question of what support is being offered and what support channels are farmers using in this context, and also speak a little bit about something that's not talked about a lot, I find, in the Alberta context, and that is the adoption of the Environmental Farm Plan, a system that has been around for a long time. So in putting this all together, I hope I can get across what a rich source of data this is and the detailed insights we can gain on agri-environmental and sustainability efforts in the province by farmers. That differs quite nicely across regions, production systems, and these farmer factors. So it's not just an overview, it actually allows very detailed insights. So what do we observe? I want to show you, and what may this tell us? I shouldn't have been so straight, and what does it tell us? What can we distract from it? I won't be able to speak to every bar chart and every specific practice in detail, but I hope you, as you are experts in this field, maybe more than I am, you will be able to read this information, and maybe by looking at this webinar again or by accessing the slides, which I'm happy obviously to share, you can really extract that information that you're interested in. So the population of farmers that were surveyed, we surveyed 500 producers with the help of a market research company, Kinetech. You see that we have a nice split of farm types in the survey with a little bit of a higher share of crop producers, but we have a really nice, and that's important for representation, a really nice regional coverage of the major agriculture production regions in the province here for this 2021 survey. This is a crowded table, but maybe you can look at the second column from the left. We have here an overview of farmer characteristics and also farm characteristics as information that allows us to maybe better understand which other farmers that are adopting or not adopting certain practices, or that have certain opinions and certain viewpoints or not. And in the 2021 survey, we have a higher educated, so more higher university degree population in the survey. And we also have a larger share of farms that have cross revenues over more than $250,000. We have a lower share than usual in previous iterations of the survey when it comes to primary owned land. We have a higher share, as I said, of crop producers, and therefore a slightly lower share of livestock producers participating. And this just is a natural outcome of the recruitment of producers to participate in the survey by the market research company we engaged in this process. So what's also different in the data I will be speaking to mostly is that in the 2021 iteration presented on the right-hand side here, the questions focused on 4 key sustainability indicators around farming: water quality, soil health, air quality, and biodiversity related best management practices. In previous iterations of the survey on the left-hand side, there were many more practices asked about, much more in detail. But Laura, Carrie Ann, and other colleagues at AFRED decided it would be more valuable to focus on these key areas and the practices that are covered by these areas. And so I'll be going over these agri-environmental risk areas in a bit more detail, and then speak about other parts that the survey looked at. So first, let's look at soil health or soil fertility or soil quality related agri-environmental best management practices. And again, I won't be able to speak to all the bar charts, but you see the 5 major most important practices associated with soil health, and you see in black the percentage of adoption across these 500 representative farmers in 2021 as reported by them in the black bars, and then you see the increasingly lighter colored shaded bars from previous years. And you see that with the exemptions of sampling and analyzing manure for nutrient content, most practices show a trend towards increasing adoption over time. So you may ask, how can it be that some adoption can actually be lower when it previously was higher? We need to understand this is always a sample of 500 farmers from the farming population in the province. And so in one year, we may accidentally or coincidentally catch a sample that has a higher overall adoption, and in some years maybe lower. So that's would be the explanation for why adoption could be lower. But by and large, you see very interesting sort of variations in the adoptions of certain practices. And I'm going to say it right here. What I want us to think about when we look at these bar charts is that producers have motivations for adopting certain practices and maybe barriers that they face in adoption of practices. There could be barriers in terms of eligibility or whether it makes sense. But we know from research, my own research and in the literature, that a main adoption motivator is economic benefits to the farming operation. So a farmer has strong motivations to adopt soil health related management practices because it could help with productivity, and higher productivity means higher returns, means more profitability and more long-term sustainable profits for the operation. Other practices may be more to the interest of environmentally inclined populations, let's say the public. And then the question is, why would a farmer do that and invest money when the benefits of doing so don't stay on the farm, but mostly go to Edmonton and Calgary and around the world, let's say. So in the soil health area, we also ask participants about what kind of available decision support or information tools they are using. And you see this also varies quite a bit, with here the highest indication of having of a tool having been used is the 4R nutrient stewardship principles, which has been around for a while and is quite well known in the agriculture industry, obviously. And other things like the AFRED system have not been used by too many producers, but some of them are at least aware of it. So on to water quality, which has always been and will only be a more important topic in the agriculture sector moving forward, as the weather sort of throws curveballs all over the place. And here are a larger number of practices that were covered. Many of them, but not all of them, focused on how manure is handled on livestock operations. So the question, for instance, avoid storing manure within 100 meters of active water wells on the middle of this chart, has only been answered by 220 producers, because we designed the survey so that only producers with livestock that produce manure would actually be asked about such a practice. And again, you see that adoption patterns are fairly high for a large number of water-related practices. The highest being, for instance, or among the highest, is that farmers are keenly aware that applying manure to frozen or snow-covered ground, well, is not only environmentally damaging because the manure runs off on the spring, but it's also a waste of manure to put it on frozen ground where it has no ability to actually fertilize the soil. And again, here is certain practices, for instance, the one towards the lower part, where we see in 2021, there's only 40% of producers that indicated they had adopted a specific practice, which is out of line with the data from previous years. And this is mainly, again, a reason of the sampling. And that is maybe one of the disadvantages of using surveys to understand these practices on such a large scale. Again, we asked about decision support tools, and here the Alberta Irrigation Management Model, or AIM, the question only has been answered by 73 producers in the survey, but we see almost over 60% are aware of it, and 30% of those 60 have actually used it. And this is among the largest of all the water quality related decision support tools that are available to Alberta producers. On to biodiversity, which is one of these examples of agri-environmental practices where we could argue whether the majority of the benefits actually stay on farm. There may be various reasons for why farmers would want to improve biodiversity on their land, but the literature would suggest that in this case, the majority of the benefits would be available to the broader community and not necessarily just private benefits that can turn into revenues or productivity or money in some way for the producer. So again, here we see an overview of the key practices that are grouped under the biodiversity banner, and we see that avoid draining or filling in natural wetlands or sloughs, which I understand is a sort of a somewhat contagious topic overall across the prairies, is actually a practice that is adopted by way over 90% of producers, and has been an issue that had been adopted for quite a while, basically since 2012, as indicated. So for over 10 years, Alberta producers know and have done accordingly that they should not fill or drain wetlands. And you see again variation. And here it's a little bit surprising that 3 out of those 5 practices show fairly low adoption values for the 2021 iteration of the survey. And again, we also ask about 3 key decision support tools that are offered by AFRED or other organizations that are available to producers to help them manage biodiversity on their land. And it's kind of interesting to see that in all 3 cases, bordering on 70% of producers are at least aware of these information tools, and around 20 to over 30% of producers have actually made use of these biodiversity information sources. We also asked about decision support tools that we weren't sure how to best describe to certain categories of practices, so we called them the general decision support tools. And again, we have the nutrient stewardship principles here, AFRED, soil information viewer, and other sort of standards and requirements by the Soil Conservation and Weed and Pest Acts. And you see here again, awareness and also adoption or use varies quite a bit across these different tools. So it's kind of interesting to see, and this is an area where one could go into greater detail and ask the survey data, what are the characteristics of the producers in terms of production system, their age, where are they located in a province, that have heavily or less heavily adopted certain practices, and have they also used the tools? So are the producers that have used any of these tools, are they actually higher adopters of any of these practices? So is there a relationship, meaning is investing in decision support tools actually an efficient and an effective way of getting sustainability improved or even raised in the province of Alberta? So you may be asking, okay, so this guy from the university has shown us all these bar charts, a lot of information. I'm already sort of, it's over my top of my head. So a simple question is, what is actually the average level of the adoption of these agri-environmental best management practices in the province? And so we asked this question ourselves, and what we did is we created an ESA adoption score. And the score is a percentage value out of 100% possible of practices that are adopted by eligible producers. So livestock producers will only adopt livestock related practices, and crop producers will only typically adopt crop relevant production systems and so on. And so that's what this score takes into account. So in 2021, there was a total of 21 practices overall, and you see here the split up, 7 water, 5 soil, and so on. And so we can analyze what the rate of adoption overall is across these different 21 practices. And so the results are on the next slide. So across the province of Alberta, all 500 producers, independent of their farm type or their age or where they are located in the province or anything else, this is the score for eligible practices. So practices a farmer could adopt and how many have they adopted. So farmers that are eligible to, or that are eligible to adopt biodiversity practices have typically adopted on average 69, close to 70%. And that's, I think, a very interesting result. When it comes to air quality, maybe an area that is a little bit less tangible and maybe even harder to understand for producers, that's on the lowest side with only 42% on average. So the average of these averages is 60%. So Alberta producers have adopted on average in 2021, 60% of all the agri-environmental best management practices that they're eligible for. That's a value that I think you have to sort of let sit in your head and think about a bit. That's actually not just surprising, it's also really good. And when it comes to individual practices in these different areas, these values range between 50% and 80%. So if somebody says Alberta producers are not adopting environmentally beneficial practices, the answer should be that's wrong. The average is 60% and sometimes even up to 80%, so fairly high. It's a very good result if we think about sustainability in the sector. Just to give you a snippet, a snapshot of what's possible here, we can look not just by different practices, we can also look into different regions. And here just highlighting in yellow that, for instance, in the south of the province, water and soil health related practice adoption is among the highest in the province. When it comes to air quality, the northwest of the province is at the top. When it comes to biodiversity, the Peace region has the highest adoption scores. This is again based on the 2021 data. We could go back and do the same analysis over time and see how maybe which are the fastest adoption regions in which areas, and again, which are the farmers behind these practices and which are the farmers that don't seem to be catching on with the adoption of environmental BMPs. An important question that at least I as a researcher have spend a lot of time on together with our graduate student Sarah, for instance, is where does the funding for the adoption of these practices come from? Everything that a farmer does costs money. If the farmer perceives that the adoption of a practice to be beneficial economically on the farm, such as anything that enhances productivity, then the farmer will say, okay, what do I expect the productivity effect to be? What does it cost? Does it make sense? If the benefits are higher than the cost, I should do it purely out of economic reasoning. But what about the practices that cost more than they provide benefit, or the ones that benefit society but don't necessarily benefit the farmer at all? And what's, I want to say, almost shocking here is 83% of the farmers, of these 500 representative farmers we surveyed, said that they have been adopting these management practices with funding from none of the above sources. So we try to be fairly inclusive in terms of the organizations we are aware of that fund these practices, and 83% said they have been doing it completely on their own dime. And I think this is an important aspect to understand, that farmers are likely to adopt practices themselves with no extra funding if there are a clear financial or productivity related effect. That motivates self-funded adoption. Any other practice will sort of depend a little bit on availability of funding, if it's cost sharing or not. And this brings into the view the aspect of the Environmental Farm Plan, which is the major policy vehicle that, if a producer has an environmental farm plan, will give them access to the majority of cost share funded program to support for the adoptions of BMP practices. So the EFP is something that across Canada has actually not received a whole lot of attention so far in terms of formal research. So this study is kind of interesting, and our student Sarah has been doing quite a bit of in-depth research on the history of the farm plan and so on. In our survey, almost 50%, 47% had completed an environmental farm plan. The EFP, for instance, is becoming mandatory for dairy producers and potato producers and producers in certain industries that want to overall improve their environmental stewardship. The average of Alberta farms that have adopted an EFP, if we look at, for instance, the census data, however, is only 25%. So our participants are, because they are larger, because they are maybe more commercially oriented, tend to be a little bit more tapping into the EFP system. 32% that hadn't adopted an EFP are considering completing one in the near future, and that may be related to the fact that some industries are making it mandatory or encouraging their producers to do so. And 88% said that going through that process of getting the EFP certification is actually valuable in terms that they learn something about environmental risks, environmental issues on their operation, on their land, and maybe that gives them a different perspective on what to do about it overall. Those that have an environmental farm plan, 64% said that they have made a few changes. So maybe not all the changes that were recommended through the EFP process. And 18%, so almost 20%, said that they have made several changes, where few means maybe 2 or 3, and several means maybe a majority share of the items that were recommended. So the EFP is very farm specific, means that between two neighbors, the recommended changes, adoption of BMPs, can vary significantly. So that's why we used sort of this vague wording here a little bit. So we then wanted to better understand why did farmers complete this EFP? It's a burdensome process. It takes time. People are trampling around your farm, asking questions that may not always be pleasant. And what our survey question here shows that there are some clear reasons for why farmers invest in the environmental farm plan. And having an environmental farm plan is known to have a positive effect on the adoption of these BMP practices. So it's a major vehicle of getting farmers to adopt these management practices. Getting access to funding is important has been said is important by 62%. Identifying and really addressing the environmental risks, for instance, to water or soil, which are key productive factors on the farm, 71% said it was an important reason. And we may believe that is maybe a strong motivation or not. 72% said they want to promote environmental stewardship on their land. So on my land, the sentence would complete here. So these are three top factors that motivated investing in the environmental farm plan as a vehicle to adopt cost or to get into cost sharing programs for the adoptions of these BMPs. But we also turned around and said, okay, for those who had not, why did you not adopt it? And what we see here is that, well, I say it's less clear on why not, but if we're honest, it's time consuming. Everybody knows. Some people believe it's not useful for their operation, 26%. 22% actually said they admitted, I don't know what an EFP is. And surprisingly, when we provided respondents or participants with a definition of the EFP, no single of the 500 producers got it right. They all selected a definition that was close to what the EFP officially stands for, but no single producer got the official lengthy definition of the EFP right. And then 24% said none of the above. They may have reasons for why not. Maybe they didn't want to engage in that discussion in the survey anyway. But here is a more varied list of why not. So the reasons for why not tend to be more all over the place than the set of motivations that gets farmers to adopt an EFP. So that is the portion of the survey that has been done basically since 2010 or 2012. And so we can make comparison and understand how farm and managerial and other regional factors influence the adoption of these agri-environmental practices. But it doesn't, the 2021 survey, as I said, we did it in a collaborative fashion, so we wanted to go several steps further, and probably something for the future to use this survey to understand and investigate issues that are popping up more recently. So sustainable sourcing practices, and I'm providing a definition as we gave it to producers in the survey. Sustainable sourcing practices are new sustainability standards that are typically developed by large agribusiness buyers of commodities, so the Cargills, the ADMs, and other big trading companies for commodities. And these sustainability standards require producers to have or prove certain sustainability practices on their farm for the buyer to accept their commodity. So let's say Archer Daniels Midland is buying canola in the province of Alberta and requires canola producers to have an environmental farm plan and to adopt the recommended practices, BMPs, of that farm plan, or they will not commit to buying the canola from these producers anymore. So this is sort of loosely explained what sustainable sourcing practices are doing and are said to be increasingly demanding from producers in Alberta and other places. So we wanted to understand what are the motivations for farmers to engage and adopt sustainable sourcing practices for their requirements, and also what are the barriers for why producers may not be wanting to participate in these practices or the programs. And you see here that a big important motivation factor is that increased public trust in the agriculture industry. 67% of producers said, I'm engaging in a sustainable sourcing practice discussion and I'm fulfilling the requirements because I want to help increase public trust, social license kind of issues in the agriculture industry. 61% are motivated by consumer confidence. 74% are motivated and maybe forced to be motivated to maintain access to existing markets, many of which are international commodity markets, and so demand and perceptions and standards in different countries such as Europe, the US, and elsewhere. And 65% that participating in sustainable sourcing programs and fulfilling the BMP requirements may give me access to new markets that have fairly stringent or increasingly stringent requirements for the commodities that are used in the supply chain. We were interested in maybe how crop producers as farmers and livestock producers, ranchers, and mixed farms, which we distinguish in the survey, how they may differ. And so for crop producers, maintaining access to markets and possibly receive a premium are two strong motivations for participating in sustainable sourcing. Ranchers, on the other side, are more concerned and motivated by consumer confidence, by public trust and social license, and also by the fact that the livestock industry is setting their own standards And you're probably aware of what's happening in terms of the sustainability efforts of the livestock industry here in the province. So that's reflected in how ranchers view sustainable sourcing and what motivates them to participate. Mixed farms, access to new markets, maintaining markets, and also sort of maybe so the internal discussions in the agriculture sector, you know, should we be doing this? What are you doing? So neighbors discussing the benefits of sustainable sourcing is the highest or among the highest of motivating factors amongst mixed farms. So here are the reasons for non-participations. These are the barriers that keep producers maybe from not participating. And I apologize for the sort of poor formatting of this slide here. The requirements that come with the auditing and the record keeping, which to many producers is a pain, is among the highest of the barriers with 55%. Very down on the list is actually the cost associated with fulfilling these requirements. And this is again comes back to what I said about BMP adoption as well. If the cost of doing something are perceived to be higher than the financial benefits on farm of doing something, then farmers will, as we all would, perceive something more as a barrier. If I need to invest into something and I feel that the benefits of doing so short, medium term will outweigh the cost, I typically am much more motivated to do something like that because it makes money, and farmers, let's not forget, ranchers, crop producers are businesses, and some of them are large businesses. So benefits and costs and profitability and returns are top of mind and should be top of mind. So what the non-participation reasons also highlight is that in industries where maybe those market access issues are not that prevalent, using them as motivations is less severe, and so there may be reasons for not participating if that pressure is not there. We wanted to understand the differences between crop, livestock, and mixed farms, and so here you see predominantly ranchers feel that the cost of engaging in sustainable sourcing for livestock production are too high and are a barrier. And that seems to be the only really high factor in relative to other farmer groups. For crop producers, it's I don't see a premium benefit. I don't see how this will help me in my marketing, so I'm not doing it. And I need to better understand what the system does. So need for information are things that are holding crop producers back. And every other factor matters to mixed producers. And if you go through the rows, actually the values are higher even for too difficult to change current farming practices is 33% amongst mixed farms, but also 46% of ranchers say it's a little important. So that's the value with the 1+, meaning important and not very important. And yes, I should have sensed my last slide. This is what I wanted to give you an overview of. So just to maybe recap here on my thank you slide before we can go into questions. My objective here was to provide you with an overview and a few snapshots of what this 2021 survey and previous survey can provide in terms of detailed understanding of environmental practice adoption, awareness, sort of barriers and motivations or barriers and opportunities. And we need to keep in mind really that looking at this data, we need to put ourselves in the minds of a farmer, owner, operator, or rancher, owner, operator, and think about the financial and economic considerations that are working behind what we observe here. Private benefits, if the benefits are greater than the cost, I probably should do it. Public benefits, am I doing something to please consumers around the world? What is the cost benefit calculation here? If the costs are high and the benefits are low, that's where we see non-adoption predominantly. But I'm going to leave it here, and I'm going to end my presentation. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks very much. Oh. Where are we?
Great, thank you, Sven. Lots of numbers, lots of information shared. Wow, okay. I definitely encourage people to type a question into the chat. And also, if you choose to raise your hand with in reactions, we can feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question when I see your hand go up. There was one question that come through the chat. Anne was wondering whether there could be a selection bias in the sample and how the research addresses it?
So the way the recruitment takes place, and I spoke to the sampling and how that may explain how those values could actually be lower. I think that's I've done so many surveys, and that's always the #1 concern, to avoid a sampling bias. And so the way producers were recruited based on our introduction wording and so on, and working with the market research company, I think we can be pretty certain that we did not create a bias so that only environmentally inclined producers were participating. I think we have a lot of confidence in this survey, and AFRED and Laura and Carrie-Anne have worked with the same market research company in previous years, and I've seen all the data, and that's what I do from morning to night, looking at these kinds of data. I'm 100% confident there is no or very minimal selection bias. Farmers get bombarded with a lot of surveys, and so whether a farmer participates or not could be a decision in a snap of a second, could be an interesting survey title, could be maybe a bonus or compensation payment that they receive from market research companies. So we can never ever exclude any bias, but I think we did our utmost to minimize it or eliminate it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I know I have a question. As you were presenting, I was thinking that you said that 62% completed the EFP to qualify for program dollars. However, earlier on, you said the majority of producers didn't adopt practices because of payment. They were just doing it because it made sense for their operation ultimately. So I guess, and how would you explain the discrepancy between the adoption practices and then completing an EFP, I guess?
So the vast majority, when they were asked about have you received funding from these list of predominant sources for BMP adoption, 83% said they had not received funding from the above sources. So it's all in percentages. So percentages can describe subsample. And then 47% had said they have adopted the EFP. That means they are eligible for cost share funding from all of these programs. Whether they apply for cost share funding, we have not asked. But we know that the cost of doing the paperwork and the time of meeting these requirements is typically not something farmers are looking forward to deal with. So even though we have a sample that has a high EFP adoption share, we also have farmers that 83% said they have not used the available funding, meaning that they do the EFP for the reasons that some farmers indicated they have to or they want to, but that doesn't necessarily translate directly into them calling all available agencies and asking how they could get cost share funding. So, and through the research, the more detailed research that Sarah, the student, did in her thesis, for instance, we learned that this connection between EFP and BMP is actually weak. So that begs the question, why are they getting the EFP and why are they not using it if they do get it to get access to funding? Maybe is the funding system too cumbersome? Does the EFP allow them to do other things that may not require on cost share funding? And I think that's why I keep repeating this. I can get the EFP for whatever reason. If I find something is productivity or economically, financially beneficial, I should do it without any policy program and somebody tapping on my shoulder. I should just do it because it makes sense. What we, I think, should be analyzing in more detail are programs where we know that the costs outweigh the on-farm benefits, and then better understand what the role of EFP and cost share funding is and which are the farmers who are playing in this game and which are the farmers that are not part of this system yet, if that makes sense.
It's definitely not black and white, but I definitely understand what you're saying. Yeah, it's a step process, right? And yeah, it's interesting. So there's another question. Given the divergence between public and private benefits, do you see an appetite in Alberta to bridge this gap and incentivize or positive or negative incentives? What could this look like in terms of policy?
So yes, I can speak to that, but we have to step away from the survey for a second here, because that survey doesn't answer everything, although we would like it to. So there's literature out there and studies in the US, not so much in Canada, but in other parts of the world, that show that if you want a farmer to adopt a practice and do something that society values, but the farmer doesn't see much sense in, cost share funding doesn't cut it. Because first of all, farmers have to invest time and money to apply for cost share funding, but typically they sit on 30 to 50% of the cost. So why should I spend 50% of the cost if I see zero value in doing this? To my knowledge, there's not a good system that would fund farmers 100% for doing this. I want you to leave something alone, or would want you to not do something. What is your cost? And then I'll pay you for that. The system exists, and it's called reversed auctions. You survey farmers and you try to find the farmers that would have the lowest cost of doing something or not doing something. And then you start paying them for what you want them to do until you have exhausted typically your budget. Let's say you have $2 million, you would pay farmers at the lower cost end. And there would always be some farmers, for them it would be increasingly difficult to do that. So they would have very high cost of changing something. And those farmers we would typically just leave alone, but we would try to maybe capture 80% of the farmers that we can incentivize to change. But we should pay them. If companies are supposed to do something that they cannot pay for, the money comes from other sources and it gets paid for. And I think agriculture should not be treated differently. If society wants farmers to do something or not do something that is not really related to what they should be doing, producing things to make money, we should pay them 100%, no questions asked, with the monitoring and so on, but yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for putting on your Professor Anders hat there.
Thank you.
I know this is your area of study for sure. Okay, yeah, I'm not, hopefully maybe even if Sven can't answer it, Laura can answer it. But are there specific regions of the province that have a higher uptake of EFPs than others?
I think we didn't present this, but this is something that we can pull out very easily. There's no clear answer to that question, because different regions have, for instance, Southern Alberta has more livestock and has the feedlot industry. So when we think about livestock related practices, Southern Alberta would have a highest adoption of those, but that goes without saying because they have the majority of livestock production. If we go to the Peace River, we have predominantly crop operations, and you could even argue a certain type of crop operations are predominantly there. So if we look at the BMPs that, let's say, are wheat canola related, the Peace River region might have the highest adoption there. So there is this connection between production system and region that basically reflects what's happening where. And even without having the numbers, I would put money down to say that you would find the highest adoption where the specific crop or livestock production system is most prevalent in the province. And that's why knowing where the farms are located and what they do and who they are helps us to really understand what's going on here.
And Sven, the report does confirm that. I quickly looked it up, and the Peace region's adoption of EFP is at 35%, which is statistically lower than the South, which has the highest adoption of EFP at 59%.
Yeah.
So bang on.
Yeah, thanks. And I was even meaning sort of in BMP adoption, so the individual practices are reflecting that as well. Yeah.
Okay. I know the question came from Ryan, and Ryan, if you want the specific numbers or breakdown, I'd encourage you to send an email to Laura and she can connect Sven in with you. And I guess, yeah, and Laura, your contact was in the invite, so hopefully you have it, and then I'll also post it at the end of the session here. So the next question is, do you think that the type of growing seasons in the past couple of years, so COVID and etc., have affected adoption, being that the same practices saw quite a decrease in adoption, other than just the sample of respondents?
Could be, but we didn't ask for COVID effects because this wasn't, if you can avoid bringing very current shocks to the industry into a conversation, that's better, because we want producers to reflect more broadly on the agri-environmental and the sustainability space in the operations. It might be So maybe, if you say between the sampling and maybe producers' willingness to participate in surveys during times where everybody's a little sort of frustrated and down, that may have had an effect. So I would say, yes, you're right, but I don't think it's a strong factor. But we don't know. The next survey will show.
This is true. Yeah, I was actually kind of thinking the same. I'm like, why is it down? But yeah, it just depends, right? And yeah, that's why the trends and continuation of the survey is important.
With the next survey, if that trend is confirmed, we may be able to show that maybe certain areas are losing importance in the minds of producers and others that we have seen continuously growing. I haven't paid attention enough to be able to say whether those practices are the ones that are, overly cumbersome, and therefore maybe even during COVID, producers said, you know what, let's leave it. Maybe we'll do it in 5 years or something like this. There could be many reasons at work here.
And I have to share the comment from Anne in regards to payment of practices. And she had said in regards to your answer earlier, and she said, but this is true, but this concept is not very palatable in Alberta. And I was actually kind of thinking, it sounds like a European utopia scenario. And that would be great. But at the same time, yeah, we don't, the population, whatever the situation is, it's a challenging one.
It's, yeah, I mean, apology. I grew up in Germany and I was educated there, so it's in my head, but my colleague Peter Boxall or others would know better maybe in the Canadian context, but it's not unheard of in the United States in this agriculture sector. The idea is catching on in North America. So, I'm not saying it should happen tomorrow, but it's certainly something to keep thinking about it. And in other areas, public willingness to pay for things is there. So why not speak to the public and say, look, if you want the agriculture sector to do all these things that have little or nothing to do with what they should be doing or what they want to do, then we have to find a way to pay for it. And if you don't want to pay for it, then you cannot expect producers to do it. I think that argumentation is something that, I don't know if it's palatable, but it's the truth.
Yeah, and I think it's come to light, I think, during COVID, because I think we understand our food system a little bit better, or the general public. And so, yeah, the discussion is definitely happening.
Yeah.
So what work has been done on quantifying farmers' opportunity costs for different environmental and sustainable practices?
So according to my senior colleague, Peter Boxall, who is just sort of gliding off into retirement, is that overall this BMP topic, and especially the environmental farm plan subject, has barely been touched across Canada. It is very difficult to find any sort of consistent data in this area pretty much beyond this survey. And so this is a point of pride for the province. I would certainly underscore that. And even Ottawa doesn't have this data. So what I'm trying to say is there's not much data to do this kind of research on. The majority of research on BMPs has been done by crop scientists and entomologists and livestock scientists that are basically developing these practices and measuring their potential effects scientifically. But that means they're typically not looking at what the cost implications or the opportunity cost or the benefits even in cost economically are. So this is very cumbersome because we would have to evaluate each practice in a fairly representative producer population to understand the opportunity costs. The technique here that I would sort of springs up in my mind is that, again, the survey method of reversed auctions, where we ask producers at what price they would be willing to offer something, is a really interesting and valuable tool here. So you survey people, you understand who they are, where they come from, and then you say, okay, here's a bunch of practices. At what price point would you start bidding for doing it? And if this is done properly, you can actually attract producers at the point of their opportunity cost, let's be honest, plus a little bit of a profit margin. If I can do it for $50 an acre, and of course I'm not bidding at 50, I'm bidding at 60, and then I'm feeling really good about it. But that, to me, would be a way forward of learning more about what the price points for producers would be, and And I think the policy community would have to come out, or the industry would have to come out and say, look, here are 3 or 4 practices we really would like to understand more about. You researchers, do the research, come back, and then we can budget something and actually understand if we really could push the adoption of these specific practices in a way that's really fair to producers, because we take the opportunity cost into consideration. And I think this would go down better in the agricultural sector, not just in Alberta, if it takes a producer perspective, as opposed to be what the literature is full of. And I think the policy community is these sort of top-down, you guys should be doing this and that mentality, which I think has burned a few bridges when it comes to the agri-environmental portfolio. But that's just my professorial opinion.
Wow. Okay. Lots of food for thought. There isn't any more questions in the chat right now. I'm just wondering, does anybody want to turn on their mic and ask a question? We're 2 minutes prior to our hour. No? Okay. All right. Well, what I will do is I will say thank you for attending today's session. Lots of really engaging questions, lots of information you shared with us, Sven and Laura, for your support for making this survey happen. So if you do have additional questions, please follow up with Laura and Sven, and then this recording will be posted at a later date. I will post Laura and Sven's contact information, and then we'll close out for the, oh, Laura, I should apologize. I think you were going to send a quick survey to the participants to ask them to reply. Okay.
Yeah, we were just to the participants, we were going to send a link to the report so that you can have the report to read for yourself. And then also just a quick a survey just to get some feedback on the sustainability series and a little bit more on the presentation you heard today. Thank you, guys. We would appreciate your participation in that.
Thank you, everyone, for your interest.
All right. Hopefully you can see the contact information, and have a great day.